Hi there. Today's lecture is going to focus on different kinds of feminism. We'll start with some discussions of what the definition of feminism is, with a brief overview of different waves of feminism. Then we'll dive into the different kinds of feminism that are covered in our Appendix C, as well as a couple that I've added to our discussion to broaden our understanding of what feminism looks like. But first, we have to get our screen sharing going. So, as I said, we're going to begin with this notion of different kinds of feminism. How do you personally define feminism? This is something that I really want everybody to grapple with this semester. I think it's very important to consider this question because your experience and your understanding of feminism is likely different from my understanding and experience of feminism, is likely different from somebody else's, experience and definition of feminism, and so on and so forth. I do have a few quotes that I think can help guide us or maybe spur some thoughts for you. Rebecca West has said, "I myself have never been able to find out precisely what feminism is. I only know that people call me a feminist whenever I express sentiments that differentiate me from a doormat." Cherish Kramer said that feminism is the radical notion that women are human beings. Gloria Steinem has said, "A feminist is anyone who recognizes the equality and full humanity of women and men." And Audre Lorde has said, "I'm a Black feminist. I mean, I recognize that my power as well as my primary oppressions come as a result of my Blackness as well as my womanness, and therefore my struggles on both of these fronts are inseparable." These are just some places to start with your understanding of feminism. I'd like to also give you some context about the history of feminism to help you guide your understanding and processing of this. Typically, we begin with the first wave of feminism. This is, kind of summed up with this notion of suffrage. It's the fight that women have to gain the right to vote. And this is, marked by protesting and different political acts, but really first wave feminism, although it did encompass some discussions of other, areas of equality for women, it really centered on women earning the right to vote. And I say women with the big asterisk that is white women. Second wave feminism pops up in the 1960s and begins to open up the discussion of what women's experiences were like in the home and in the workplace, and trying to strive for more equality in those areas. You hear the phrase, "the personal is political," start to be used there. And the idea is that what goes on in the home is something that is actually more political and governed by systems of oppression than would, just seem like it is. Third wave feminism starts in the 1990s as a kind of backlash against second wave feminism to an extent. Really, it could also just be seen as an extension of many of the things that were discussed during second wave feminism. We see women start to broaden their scope and fight for cultural representation beyond what is talked about in the second wave. Women are reclaiming different terms. There's an emphasis on more control over sexuality and different kinds of sexuality. We also see rejections of representations of women in media and a call for broader kinds of depictions, more empowerment for women. Now, fourth wave is debated in terms of, well, does it fully exist? I think largely academics would argue that there is a fourth wave of feminism. This is encompassing an even bigger net of individuals who are marginalized and need equal rights. And we also see the use of new technology, online activism really taking place to continue the march, the fight for equal rights. These are some of the waves of feminism. Again, first, second, third are pretty well agreed upon by academics. Fourth wave mostly is. Some scholars may start arguing that there is a fifth wave. And so this is just a way to help you understand some of the history of feminism as you're thinking about what feminism means to you. We'll now talk about some different kinds of feminism as they're discussed in our chapter. And this can also give you some areas to think about with regard to what feminism looks like for you. Liberal feminism is this idea that equality of rights should extend to all individuals. And we say equality of rights, really what we're talking about are the rights that white, middle-class, heterosexual men, cisgender men experience and have. In a lot of ways, we can see this in our daily lives through the influence of harmful stereotypes about sex and gender. Think about this as a way to kind of understand, this concept. Kids are given specific toys when they're little. Boys will get sports equipment and maybe doctor kits, whereas little girls will be given baby dolls and kitchen equipment. And the idea reinforces this split notion of what's available to boys and girls, what's available to men and women. That then plays out in our adult lives, where we do see limited access for women and other marginalized categories of people into these different spheres of society, such as the military, sports, healthcare environment, other, places in our social strata. So liberal feminism, everybody should have equal rights. We can move on to radical feminism, which I think really gets a bad rap because of the term radical. But effectively what radical feminism is arguing is that we should be dismantling patriarchy. Patriarchy being this overarching social kind of system that props up or privileges men, masculinity, maleness at the expense of everything that does not fall into that category. So radical feminism isn't like, oh, I hate men, but it's more of a critique of patriarchy. Systems of equality exist in lots of areas. You can think about financial systems of equality, political, social, and these systems exist to help keep men in positions of power. One area where you might think about this is the United States legislature, right? Congress. This is a place where we do frequently see it's dominated by men, it's dominated by white men, it's dominated by older white men, older straight white men. And these are the decision makers of what happens to the rest of the country, which is much more diverse than just that category, right? That group of individuals. So you might see a table full of men talking about women's reproductive rights. These are systems of power that oppress others and can do so in a way that keep those men in power at the expense of others. Now, more of a social system of power we could use as an example that exists around sexuality and sexual assault. We see here the influence of rape myths, victim blaming. Well, if you didn't dress so provocatively, you wouldn't be enticing men to assault you. That kind of notion is a social system. It's an idea that exists to allow men to maintain their power while silencing women's experiences. So this notion of radical feminism is all about dismantling patriarchy and those systems of power. Marxist feminism is another kind of feminism that exists that really critiques the capitalist system as it oppresses women as workers. So here what we're talking about is that if you look at workers in general, they are oppressed by, this kind of small percentage of individuals who own and control the wealth in the society. And Marxist feminism looks specifically at how women are impacted by that experience. We might see underneath this umbrella an emphasis on fighting for gender pay equality, specifically looking at like the pay gap, which we know impacts women, white women, differently than it impacts women of color. You may also see as a critique of this the places that women are allowed to work or encouraged to work, such as, the education field, which typically doesn't make as much money as a field that may be dominated by men, like finance, the financial field, right? So there's a kind of critique of how women are, you know, pushed into these different categories of work so that they're oppressed differently than men. I think another important concept to bring up here is this notion of the glass ceiling, which talks about this inability for women to advance beyond where there's usually a stopping point, a ceiling, if you will. However, it doesn't prevent women from being able to see that there are other opportunities that they could be advancing to. However, that ceiling still exists. And so it's very frustrating. It can be really difficult for women to know that their advancement in their career gets stalled by their sex. Let's talk a little bit about intersectional feminism. Intersectional feminism is really a concept that I think can apply across broad categories of feminism. And so really that can be true of lots of these kinds of feminism. They're not mutually exclusive of each other. There is some crossover between them. Intersectional feminism is focusing on the idea that our lives are not marked by one thing at a time, one experience at a time, but all of the different things that make up who we are affect the way that we are oppressed. So think about this: your gender identity, your gender expression, your sex identity, maybe your sexual orientation, your race. These are going to have different varying levels of acceptance within social society. So how you are oppressed personally varies based on the different identity markers that you claim. Think about this example. Heterosexual Latinx women are marginalized in different ways than white transgender women. The idea here that is, kind of a summary of this: groups are not monolithic. I can't say women experience this because women is a very broad category and encompasses a broad group of people who do not all have the same experiences. Intersectional feminism wants you to critique that notion and really be specific and intentional with the language you use when making feminist critiques. This transnational feminism, the idea of transnational feminism really lends itself, it's just kind of a natural extension of intersectional feminism in a lot of ways, because transnational feminism is exploring non-Western feminism, right? So again, we can't just say women experience this. Well, what we're talking about primarily is what white women in, the West are experiencing, the West being the United States, Canada, Europe, that portion of the world. That does not mean that we have the same experiences as women who live in other parts of the country. And transnational feminism is looking to interrogate that more and try to critique colonialism, neoliberalism, and other structures that are detrimental to women outside of the West. We see that Western powers have engaged in behaviors that have oppressed women for centuries, and it has limited their access to be able to take control, to be able to have equal rights. Western powers tend to exploit that in the hopes of gaining resources. You can talk about this in terms of the need for cheap consumer goods leading to workers in non-Western countries working for very little to produce those goods, and how that negatively impacts them. In non-Western countries, the access to clean water, healthcare, I should say non-Western and in Western countries, but really, again, this is just a kind of a critique of colonialism more broadly. But really having access to clean water, healthcare, education are having limited access to those things are byproducts of colonial-minded historical events. Another kind of example of this would be looking at and critiquing appropriation of culture, fetishization of women of different cultures. So, the kind of notion of maybe taking part of Indian culture and like I'm a white woman and I'm gonna wear a sarong and it's totally fine and I don't see any problem with that even though it's not my culture. Or someone being like, oh, Asian women are hot, this kind of, taking of different people's cultures and objectifying it and not being respectful of those cultures and what the women in those cultures experience. The last kind of feminism that the chapter talks about is postmodern feminism. This is this notion that all categories are constructed. So you can't really make generalizations, broad generalizations about sex and gender. The idea here being, reality is subjective. Everybody has their own lived experiences, their own specific personal reality, and we don't all share the same common, we don't all have the same experience, so we can't all talk about things in the same way. Postmodern feminism really critiques essentialism, the notion that things are or are not, binaries of this is or isn't, gender binaries, you're male or female, you're straight or gay. And postmodern feminism really tries to dismantle that. The notion of how we identify ourselves really isn't based on any kind of objective reality, but rather how we understand our realities based on our experiences in the world and what we have been taught and how we have been socialized to believe things about ourselves. Categorical thinking such as male, female, straight, gay, white, non-white, under this umbrella of postmodern feminism, that is categorical thinking that oppresses people because it limits their ability to live freely and live according to their experiences. So postmodern feminism falls under the bigger umbrella, the bigger ideology of postmodernism, and really challenges this idea that people can just be put into specific categories without their, because those categories don't exist. I have two other kinds of feminism I want to talk about. Briefly, I will talk about womanism. Womanism is this really kind of rose up in response to second wave feminism, white feminism. Womanism focuses on women of color and their experiences of oppression. These are different than what white women experience. We talk about this a little bit. We talked about this some with intersectional feminism, with transnational feminism. Womanism specifically situates women of color. That is the focal point of this kind of feminism. And it really pushes back against white feminism because white feminism can do a lot to harm women of color. I think one of the critiques here would be that concerns of race outweigh concerns of gender and sex in terms of the struggle for what needs to be given more consideration. And so womanism argues that, the concerns of women of color come at odds with white feminism. They need their own space to exist, their own kind of elevation of discourse, right? So this term is, again, this is really critiquing the ways that white feminism overlook and continue to oppress women of color and their experiences. And our last kind of feminism to discuss today is ecofeminism. Ecofeminism makes the argument that we are all interconnected and women intrinsically, their oppression is related to the oppression of the environment. There's a lot of argument in ecofeminism that the male-dominated practices that exist in governments and around the world, decisions made about how to care for the environment, are harmful not only to the environment but also to women, and that in order to allow women to have equal rights, we have to take care of the planet, because if you hurt the planet, it's going to also hurt women. Thinking about, global warming and having, people have to flee where they live because their country is getting flooded by rising seawaters, that affects women and other marginalized groups disproportionately more than it does people who are in positions of power and privilege. So these, critiques of male-dominated practices that are harmful to the environment are also harmful to women and other marginalized groups. So that covers it for today. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of an overview of different kinds of feminism. If you've got questions, if you want to discuss some of these more fully, I'm happy to talk about it with you. And I look forward to hearing what you think with regards to your kind of definition and understanding of feminism.